They found him in a wheelchair and thought it made him weak. Dean Holloway's gang had ruled Cedar Grove through terror for years, and a disabled black veteran moving into their all-white town was just another chance to prove their power. But fear has a funny way of blinding people to danger. None of them thought to check why Henry Thompson's military file was above top secret. None of them asked about the 27 perfect shots that made him a legend in 3 war zones. And not one of them wondered why battle-hardened soldiers still whisper his codename, Hawk, like a prayer to ward off death. Now as they cruise past his house with baseball bats and hate in their hearts, Henry sits in the dark, his sniper's hands perfectly still. He's fought monsters worse than them in places God forgot. And Cedar Grove is about to learn why you should never mistake patience for weakness. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The moving truck's diesel engine rumbled to a stop on Maple Street, its shadow stretching across pristine suburban lawns in the late afternoon sun. Behind drawn curtains and half-closed blinds, dozens of eyes watched as 2 movers began unloading furniture into the old Morrison house. Their whispers carried across manicured gardens, spreading like wildfire through the quiet neighborhood. Did you see? A black man. In a wheelchair. Henry Thompson sat in his customized wheelchair at the end of the concrete path, directing the movers with calm precision. The chair was top of the line, its titanium frame custom-fitted to his body, each component selected for durability and maneuverability. His military-trained eyes didn't miss the subtle movements behind neighboring windows or the quick dart of curtains falling back into place. After 20 years as a sniper, he'd learned to spot the smallest details. And right now, every house on the street was watching him. "That box goes in the study," he said, his deep voice steady and controlled. "The one marked books." The younger mover nodded, struggling slightly with the weight. Henry could have told him there were 3 sniper rifles hidden among those books, each one painstakingly cleaned and maintained, but he kept that information to himself. Instead, he watched as the man disappeared into the house, his footsteps echoing through empty rooms. The late afternoon light painted long shadows across the lawn when Sarah Mitchell stepped out of the house next door, her young son Danny trailing behind her. She approached with the cautious steps of someone who wanted to appear friendly but wasn't quite sure they should be. Henry noticed her right hand gripping Danny's shoulder just a little too tight, her knuckles white with tension. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Sarah said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wore the kind of casual clothes that suggested she worked from home. "I'm Sarah, and this is Danny." The boy stared openly at Henry's wheelchair, curiosity written across his face. Henry's lips curved into a gentle smile, the kind he'd perfected over years of putting nervous civilians at ease in war zones. "Henry Thompson, pleasure to meet you both." He turned his chair slightly to face them better, the movement smooth and practiced. 20 years in the chair had taught him how to make every motion appear effortless. Danny pointed at the wheelchair, his child's curiosity overwhelming his mother's attempts to teach him manners. "What happened to your legs?" "Danny." Sarah's face flushed red with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Thompson, he doesn't understand." Henry waved away her concern with a practiced gesture. "No need to apologize, curiosity is natural." He looked at Danny directly, seeing the same innocent questioning he'd seen in children's eyes across 3 continents. "I was injured while serving our country, young man. But don't worry, I get around just fine." Before the conversation could continue, a pickup truck roared past, engine revving unnecessarily loud. The vehicle was lifted, its oversized tires kicking up dust and gravel. Henry caught the Confederate flag sticker in the back window and the sneering face of the driver, a man he'd later learn was Dean Holloway. The truck's passage left behind a scatter of fast food wrappers and empty beer cans across Henry's new lawn, the litter a clear message of disrespect. Sarah's face tightened, lines of worry appearing around her eyes. That happens sometimes here. Maybe you should report." "No need," Henry interrupted softly, his voice carrying the weight of experience. I've dealt with worse, much worse, he thought, remembering the whistling of bullets in Kandahar, the weight of his rifle against his shoulder as he protected his unit from threats they couldn't even see. The memory of those days sat heavy in his mind, but his face remained calm, revealing nothing. The movers continued their work as the sun began to set, carrying boxes and furniture into the house. Henry had chosen this place carefully. Single story, open floor plan, wide doorways. The real estate agent had been surprised when he'd insisted on seeing the blueprints before making an offer, but 20 years of tactical planning had taught him the importance of knowing his terrain. Later that evening, after the movers had gone and Sarah had hurried Danny home for dinner, Henry wheeled himself through his new house. The floors were hardwood, good for wheelchair mobility, and the doorways had all been widened to accommodate his chair. The modifications had cost extra, but money wasn't an issue. The government paid well for 20 years of perfect shots and classified missions. In the living room, Henry carefully unpacked a silver picture frame, his calloused fingers gentle against the delicate metal. Maria smiled up at him from behind the glass, her dark eyes bright with life, her hand resting on his shoulder as he sat in his dress uniform. The picture had been taken just weeks before the cancer took her, before the woman who'd stood by him, through war and injury, was stolen away by an enemy he couldn't fight with a scope and trigger. "Well, honey," he whispered to the empty room, adjusting the frame until it sat perfectly level on the mantel. "This is home now." The next morning found Henry at the local diner, more eyes watching as he maneuvered his chair up to a table. The ramp at the entrance was new, legally required but clearly rarely used. Inside, conversations died as he entered, replaced by the sound of clinking coffee cups and whispered comments. The waitress approached with visible hesitation, her pad clutched tight in her hand, her name tag reading, "Betty. Coffee black," he said before she could speak. "And the breakfast special." His voice was gentle, practiced at putting people at ease. It was the same voice he'd used to calm rookie snipers before their first mission, the same tone that had talked countless men through their first kill shots. Behind him, he could hear the whispers, his trained ears picking up every word. Despite the speaker's attempts at discretion, "Trouble," someone muttered. "Mark my words, these people always bring trouble. Why'd he have to come here? We were doing just fine without his kind. Bet he's one of them activists, trying to stir things up, probably working with them northern agitators." Henry sipped his coffee calmly when it arrived, ignoring the whispers just as he'd once ignored the sound of mortar fire while lining up a shot. The coffee was terrible, bitter and burnt, but he'd had worse in forward operating, bases across 3 continents. He ate his breakfast methodically, each bite measured and precise, his military discipline evident even in this simple act. The bell above the diner's door chimed, and the whispers suddenly stopped. Henry didn't need to turn around to know someone important had entered. The change in atmosphere was enough. Heavy boots crossed the linoleum floor, stopping just behind his chair. The footsteps were deliberate, meant to intimidate, but Henry had faced down too many real threats to be frightened by theatrical displays. "Well, well," a voice drawled, thick with false friendliness. "Looks like we got ourselves a new neighbor." Henry turned his chair slowly, coming face to face with Dean Holloway. The man was tall, with the kind of muscles that came from manual labor rather than a gym. His eyes were cold, calculating, and fixed on Henry with unmistakable hostility. A thin scar ran along his jaw, and his knuckles bore the marks of someone who solved problems with his fists. "Name's Dean," he said, not offering his hand. "This here's my town. Been my family's town for generations." Behind him stood 2 other men, both trying to look tough but lacking Dean's natural menace. Henry met his stare evenly, his sniper's eyes taking in every detail. The way Dean shifted his weight, the tension in his shoulders, the subtle signs of someone ready for violence. "Every town belongs to all its people," he replied quietly. The diner had gone silent enough to hear a pin drop, the other patrons watching the confrontation with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Dean's face darkened, the false friendliness dropping away like a mask. "That's where you're wrong. Some people don't belong certain places. Best learn that quick." He turned and walked away, his boots echoing on the floor, his message delivered. The rest of the day passed in a blur of unpacking and organizing. Henry methodically arranged his home, everything placed within easy reach from his chair. In his study, he carefully assembled a gun cleaning kit, the motions automatic after thousands of repetitions. The familiar smell of gun oil brought back memories, some he wished he could forget, others he held on to tight. He arranged his books on the shelves, military tactics and history mixed with novels and biographies. Behind them, hidden from casual view, his rifles waited. He hadn't fired them since Maria's death, since he'd left the service and sought peace in civilian life. But he maintained them faithfully, knowing that peace often came at the price of readiness. As evening approached, the sound of engines roaring down the street made him wheel to the window. Dean's truck led a parade of vehicles past his house, all of them revving their engines and shouting. This time they left more than just trash. They left tire marks across his lawn, and a crude message spelled out in beer cans. Henry wheeled himself outside and began picking up the cans one by one, his movements unhurried and deliberate. He could feel eyes on him again, not just the gang members watching from the end of the street, but Sarah too, peeking out her window with worry written across her face. Danny appeared suddenly, running across the lawn despite his mother's startled call. "I'll help, Mr. Thompson." The boy began gathering cans, his small hands working quickly. Henry watched the child with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Thank you, Danny. But you should probably head home now. Your mother's calling." Sarah appeared at the property line, her face a mask of worry. "Danny, come here. Now." She looked at Henry apologetically. "I'm sorry about everything." Henry nodded, understanding. "No need to apologize for other people's actions, Mrs. Mitchell. Danny's a good boy. You're raising him right." Inside, after the lawn was cleaned, Henry settled in his study. On his laptop screen, old military footage played silently. A much younger Henry Thompson, standing tall and proud with his sniper unit. Their faces were blurred for security, but he remembered each one. The footage showed him taking an impossible shot at over a mile, saving his entire unit from an ambush. The younger Henry in the video moved with the fluid grace of an athlete, no hint of the injury that would later confine him to a wheelchair. A knock at the door interrupted his memories. Henry closed the laptop and wheeled to answer it. No one was there, but a piece of paper had been shoved under the door. He picked it up, reading the message scrawled in angry red letters. "You don't belong here." Henry wheeled himself to the kitchen, opened the stove, and dropped the note inside. He watched it curl and blacken in the flames, his face illuminated by the brief flare of fire. 20 years of combat had taught him patience. He could wait. He would wait. The evening settled over the neighborhood like a heavy blanket, broken only by the distant sound of crickets and the occasional car passing by. Henry sat in his darkened living room, Maria's picture catching the last rays of sunset. His fingers absently traced the wheel of his chair, the same fingers that had once pulled triggers with perfect precision, ending threats before they could even materialize. He thought about the town, about Dean and his gang, about Sarah and Danny. He thought about Maria, about what she would say if she could see him now. She had always been his moral compass, helping him navigate the complex territory between necessary force and needless violence. "Looks like we've got ourselves another war, honey," he whispered to Maria's picture. "But don't worry, I never miss." Outside, crickets chirped in the growing darkness, and somewhere down the street, an engine revved threateningly. Henry Thompson sat quietly in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, waiting for whatever would come next. He had faced down warlords and terrorists, survived firefights and ambushes. A few small-town bullies didn't worry him. As night fell completely, he began his evening routine, checking doors and windows, reviewing the security cameras he'd discreetly installed during the move, making sure everything was in its place. Every motion was precise, calculated, the habits of a lifetime of vigilance impossible to break. In his bedroom, he transferred himself from his chair to the bed with practiced ease, his upper body strength compensating for his useless legs. On the nightstand, next to a small photo of Maria, lay a handgun, cleaned, loaded, and within easy reach. Old habits died hard, and some habits kept you alive. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. Henry Thompson was ready. He had chosen this town for a reason. Its quiet streets, its distance from his past, its promise of peace. If others chose to shatter that peace, well, they would learn what many before them had learned. Appearance and ability were two very different things. The last thing he saw before turning out the light was Maria's smile in the photo, reminding him of better days and giving him strength for whatever challenges lay ahead. In the darkness, Henry Thompson slept soundly, untroubled by the hostility surrounding him. He had faced worse odds before, and he was still here, still fighting, still never missing. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when the package arrived. Henry heard the delivery truck pull away as he finished his morning coffee, the sound of its engine fading into the quiet suburban street. On his doorstep sat a simple brown box with no return address, just his name printed in block letters. 20 years of military service had taught Henry to be cautious of unexpected deliveries. He examined the package carefully from his wheelchair, checking for wires or suspicious weights. Finding nothing obviously dangerous, he brought it inside to his kitchen table. The box contained only 2 items, a weathered photograph and a handwritten note. The photo showed a younger Henry with his sniper unit, their faces clear despite the desert sun beating down on them. It was an classified image, one that shouldn't exist outside secure military archives. The note was brief. "You can't run from what you did." Henry's fingers traced the faces in the photograph. Johnson, Martinez, Williams, good men all. The image had been taken just hours before the shot that earned him the nickname Hawk. The mission that day had pushed the limits of what was possible with a rifle, but lives had been at stake. The memory swept over him, as vivid as if it were yesterday. Sand whipped across the ridge where Henry lay prone, his rifle steady despite the harsh conditions. Through his scope, he could see his unit pinned down by enemy fire nearly 2 miles away. The distance was beyond what most considered possible for a sniper shot, but Henry had always pushed boundaries. "Wind speed 17 knots right to left," his spotter whispered. "Temperature 104, humidity 12%. Henry made the calculations in his head, adjusting for every variable. The shot would have to account for wind, temperature, the curvature of the earth itself. His finger tightened on the trigger as he exhaled slowly. The crack of his rifle broke the desert silence. Through his scope, he watched the enemy gunner fall exactly 3.1 seconds later. His unit escaped safely, never knowing the shot that saved them had rewritten the books on what was possible with a sniper rifle. A car horn outside snapped Henry back to the present. He carefully placed the photo in his desk drawer, his mind working through the implications. Someone knew his past. Someone with access to classified materials. But why send it now? The sound of breaking glass interrupted his thoughts. Henry wheeled quickly to his front window. Dean Holloway's gang had graduated from littering. They'd taken a baseball bat to his wheelchair ramp. "Hey, cripple," one of them shouted. "How you gonna get out now?" Henry watched them speed away, memorizing faces and license plates. In his kitchen, he pulled out a hunting knife and began sharpening it methodically. The smooth rhythm of steel on stone calmed his mind as he considered his options. Sarah Mitchell appeared at his back door an hour later, her face tight with concern. "I saw what they did. I called the police, but they won't do anything," Henry finished for her. "It's all right, Mrs. Mitchell. I've faced worse than this." "You keep saying that," Sarah said, watching him test the knife's edge with his thumb. "What exactly did you do in the military?" Henry carefully set the knife down. "Things I'd rather not discuss. But I learned patience and strategy." He smiled slightly. "And I learned that appearances can be deceiving." In his mind, another memory surfaced. The mission had gone wrong from the start. Bad intel had put his team in the wrong position, and now they were taking fire from multiple directions. Henry watched through his scope as civilians fled the crossfire. Men, women, children, running for their lives. Then came the radio call that changed everything. "Missile strike incoming. Coordinates confirmed." "No!" Henry had shouted into his radio. "There are civilians in the target zone." Orders confirmed. Strike in 30 seconds. Henry made a choice then. 3 impossible shots in rapid succession disabled the missile guidance system on their own vehicle. The strike was aborted, but the cost had been high. His actions saved dozens of civilian lives but ended his active combat career. The memory faded as Danny's voice carried across from next door. The boy was playing in his yard, completely unaware of the tension around him. Henry watched him for a moment, reminded of the children he'd saved that day. A truck engine roared in the distance, and Henry recognized Dean's vehicle approaching. This time, Dean stepped out of his truck and walked boldly up to Henry's door. 2 other men flanked, him trying to look intimidating. "Found out some interesting things about you," Dean said, his voice carrying across the yard. "Military man, huh? Think that makes you special?" Henry wheeled himself onto the porch, positioning himself carefully. "The military taught me many things, Mr. Holloway. Patience was one of them." "Yeah? What else it teach you?" Dean stepped closer, towering over Henry's wheelchair. "Teach you to know your place?" "It taught me to recognize threats," Henry replied calmly, "and to understand the difference between those who pose real danger and those who just make noise." Dean's face darkened. "That a threat?" "No, Mr. Holloway. Just an observation." Henry's voice remained steady. "Like observing that your left hand keeps twitching toward your back pocket, where you're probably carrying a knife. Or that your friend on the right has a pistol under his jacket, which is illegal in this state without a permit I doubt he has." The color drained from Dean's face. As Henry continued, "The military taught me to notice details, like how your truck's license plate is registered to an address 20 miles from here, making you what we called a non-local aggressor in the service." Sarah had come out onto her porch, phone in hand. Dean noticed her and took a step back. "This ain't over," he growled. "No," Henry agreed. "I don't suppose it is." After they left, Sarah hurried over. "You shouldn't antagonize them," she said. "They're dangerous." Henry's mind flashed to another memory. He was training new recruits, teaching them the art of patience and precision that had made him legendary in the sniper community. "The most dangerous person in any situation," he told them, "is the one who stays calm while others lose control." "You're worried about the wrong person being dangerous," Henry told Sarah gently, "but I appreciate your concern." That evening, Danny came by with a broken remote control car, his eyes hopeful. "Mom said you're good at fixing things." Henry examined the toy carefully, noting the stripped gears and loose wiring. "Grab that toolkit from the shelf," he said, pointing. "I'll show you how to repair it." As they worked, Henry's precise movements and careful instructions revealed the same patience and skill that had once made him the military's top marksman. Danny watched in fascination as Henry's sure hands reassembled the toy. "Were you really in the Army?" Danny asked as they finished. Henry paused, choosing his words carefully. "I served our country, yes, but that's all in the past now." "Is that why those men don't like you? Because you were in the Army?" "No, Danny. They don't like me because they don't understand me. Fear often comes from ignorance." Later that night, Henry reviewed his security footage. Dean's gang had been watching, his house documenting his routines. They were planning something bigger. Henry began his own preparations, his military training kicking in automatically. He checked his supplies: first aid kit, emergency provisions, communication devices. In his study, he opened a hidden panel revealing his old sniper rifle. The weapon was clean and ready, though he hoped he wouldn't need it. A news alert on his phone caught his attention. Another veteran had been harassed in a nearby town. The pattern was familiar. Dean's crew was part of something larger, more organized. The memory of his last active mission surfaced again. The intel had been solid this time. A high-value target was meeting with local warlords. Henry was positioned 2 miles out, waiting for confirmation to take the shot. But something felt wrong. Through his scope, he watched as children were ushered into the building. The target was using human shields. "Take the shot," the command came through his radio. "Negative," Henry replied. "Civilians present." That's an order, soldier. Henry's finger tightened on the trigger, then relaxed. No. The decision cost him his career but saved his soul. The building turned out to be a school, the meeting a cover for human trafficking. His disobedience saved dozens of lives, but the psychological toll had been heavy. A car door slammed outside, bringing Henry back to the present. Through his window, he saw Dean's gang circling the block again. They were getting bolder, more aggressive. Sarah appeared at his door with a casserole, her face worried. I saw them out there again. Maybe you should report it. The police? Henry shook his head. They've made their position clear. He'd seen the local sheriff talking with Dean earlier that week, their body language speaking volumes about their relationship. Then leave, Sarah urged. It's not safe here. Running never made anything safer, Henry replied, thinking of all the times he'd held his ground under fire. Sometimes you have to face things head on. That night, Henry stayed up late reviewing old mission files. His military contacts had sent him information about similar incidents across the country, veterans being targeted, intimidated, forced out of communities. The pattern was clear, but the authorities seemed unwilling or unable to act. In his bedroom, Henry transferred himself from his wheelchair to his bed, his upper body strength making the movement smooth. On his nightstand, Maria's picture seemed to watch him with concern. I know what you'd say, he whispered to her image. You'd tell me to be careful, to think before acting, but you'd also tell me to do what's right. The sound of breaking glass downstairs brought him fully alert. Someone had thrown a rock through his window. Outside, engines revved and tires squealed. As Dean's gang made another pass, Henry wheeled to his window, watching their taillights disappear into the darkness. They were testing his responses, probing for weaknesses. But they didn't understand what they were dealing with. In his study, Henry opened his laptop and began documenting everything. Dates, times, license plates, faces. His sniper training had taught him the importance of reconnaissance, of knowing your opponent. The next morning, he found his wheelchair ramp had been further vandalized. The message was clear. They were trying to trap him, to make him vulnerable. Danny watched from next door as Henry expertly navigated the damaged ramp. How do you stay so calm? The boy asked. When people are mean to you? Henry thought carefully, before answering. Because getting angry doesn't solve problems. Planning does. Patience does. At church that Sunday, Henry could feel the tension in the congregation. Some people moved to different pews when he wheeled in. Others whispered behind, their hands. But a few nodded respectfully. They'd heard about his military service. The pastor's sermon was about tolerance, but his eyes never quite met Henry's. After the service, Dean stood with a group of men, their hostile stares following Henry as he left. He's dangerous, Henry overheard someone say. Military training. Could snap any time. Henry smiled slightly at the irony. They feared him snapping, yet they were the ones provoking confrontation. That afternoon, he cleaned his rifles, each movement precise and practiced. The familiar ritual helped him think, plan, prepare. Dean's gang was escalating, but Henry had faced worse odds in worse places. Sarah brought Danny over for help with his homework, math problems the boy was struggling with. Henry taught him about trajectory and angles, using his military experience to make the lessons interesting. See, if you want to throw a ball to your friend, Henry explained, you have to account for distance and height. It's just like other calculations I used to make. Danny's eyes lit up with understanding, not realizing he was learning the same principles that had made Henry a legendary sniper. As evening approached, Henry received another anonymous package. This one contained newspaper clippings about his unit's missions, heavily redacted but still classified. Someone was trying to send him a message. The sound of motorcycles racing past his house broke his concentration. Dean's gang had new recruits, younger, more reckless men looking to prove themselves. Henry wheeled onto his porch watching them. His trained eye noted their numbers, their weapons, their patterns of movement. They were organizing, preparing for something bigger. In his mind, another memory surfaced. He was teaching advanced sniper tactics to elite units. Your greatest weapon, he told them, isn't your rifle. It's your mind. Stay calm, observe everything, plan carefully. Now, years later, those same lessons would serve him again. Different battle, different enemy, but the principles remained the same. The night settled around him as he sat in his darkened living room, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood. Somewhere out there, Dean and his gang were planning their next move. But Henry Thompson had survived worse than small-town bullies. He looked at Maria's picture, remembering her strength during his recovery, her unwavering support through his darkest days. "Don't worry, honey," he whispered. "I'm not looking for a fight. But I'm ready if one finds me." Outside, crickets chirped in the darkness, and a cool breeze carried the promise of coming storms. Henry Thompson sat quietly in his wheelchair, his mind clear, his resolve unshaken. The battle lines were being drawn, but this time, he had chosen his ground. Let them come, he thought. They would learn what others had learned before them, that underestimating Henry Thompson was a dangerous mistake, a mistake that some had only made once. The morning air was crisp as Henry wheeled himself toward Mason's grocery, his breath forming small clouds in the autumn chill. The past week's harassment had settled into an uneasy rhythm, but Henry knew better than to let his guard down. His military instincts, honed over decades of service, remained sharp as ever. The store's automatic doors wheezed open, and Henry felt the familiar shift in atmosphere, conversations dying mid-sentence, eyes darting away from his presence, the subtle reshuffling of bodies to maintain distance. He'd grown accustomed to it, just as he'd once grown accustomed to the weight of a rifle against his shoulder. The shopping trip was almost complete when Henry heard the rumble of familiar engines in the parking lot. His hands paused on the wheels of his chair as he assessed his position in the store. 3 aisles from the exit, limited cover, multiple civilian bystanders. The automatic doors opened again, and Dean Holloway's boots scraped against the linoleum floor, followed by the footsteps of at least 4 others. "Well, look who we found doing his little shopping," Dean's voice carried through the store. "Trying to play house in our town." Henry continued selecting items from the shelf, his movements deliberately calm. He could see the other customers, quickly making their way toward the exits, leaving only the terrified teenage cashier at her register. Through the store's front windows, he spotted 2 more of Dean's crew standing guard outside. "You know," Dean continued, moving closer, "I've been doing some thinking about you, Thompson, about why you really came here." Henry turned his chair to face them, noting their positions with practiced efficiency. Dean stood front and center, trying to loom over him. 2 men flanked him, the Mackenzie brothers, local troublemakers with a history of violence. Behind them, Pete Walsh and Tommy Burke blocked the aisle's exit. All of them wore smug expressions that told Henry they thought they had the upper hand. "Mr. Holloway," Henry said evenly, "I'm just here for groceries." "See? I don't believe that." Dean kicked over Henry's shopping basket, sending cans rolling across the floor. "I think you're here to cause trouble, to stir things up, maybe even get some revenge for whatever happened to your legs." Henry's mind flashed to a similar confrontation years ago, in a village marketplace half a world away. He'd been cornered by local insurgents, forced to defuse the situation without compromising his cover or endangering civilians. The same principles applied here. Stay calm, control the space, give one clear warning. "You don't want to do this," Henry said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Not here. Not now." Dean laughed, but Henry caught the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Look at you, trying to act tough from your wheelchair. What are you gonna do, roll over our toes?" The Mackenzie brothers chuckled on cue, but their laughter had a nervous edge. Something in Henry's demeanor was setting off their instincts, warning them that they were dealing with more than just a disabled veteran. "Last warning," Henry said, his hands resting calmly on his wheels. "Walk away." Dean pulled a knife from his pocket, letting it catch the fluorescent light. Or what? What happened next was over in seconds. Henry's right wheel locked and pivoted, using his chair as a pivot point. His left arm shot out, catching Dean's wrist in a grip hardened by years of upper body training. A quick twist, and the knife clattered to the floor. Dean stumbled forward, off balance, and Henry used his momentum against him, sending him sprawling into his own men. The Mackenzie brothers moved forward, but Henry was already in motion. His chair spun with precision, his right arm sweeping low, to catch Mike Mackenzie's knee. The man went down with a yelp of pain. His brother hesitated, giving Henry the opening to grab a can from the floor and flick it with sniper's accuracy, catching him in the shoulder. Pete Walsh made the mistake of trying to grab Henry's wheelchair from behind. Henry drove his elbow back, finding the solar plexus with practiced ease. Walsh's breath left him in a whoosh, and he stumbled back into Tommy Burke, both of them tangling in their own feet. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 10 seconds, and Henry hadn't moved from his basic position. 5 men lay sprawled or staggering around him, their confident swagger replaced by shocked confusion. Dean pushed himself up, his face red with rage and embarrassment. "You're dead, Thompson, you hear me? Dead." "No," Henry replied calmly. "I'm not, but I want you to remember something." He wheeled closer to Dean, his voice dropping so only the gang leader could hear. "I learned to fight after I lost my legs. Imagine what I could do before." The implications of that statement hit Dean like a physical blow. He scrambled backward, trying to maintain some dignity as he retreated. "This isn't over." "It could be," Henry offered. "Your choice." The gang fled the store, engines roaring to life in the parking lot. Henry calmly began picking up his scattered groceries, his movements unhurried. The teenage cashier stared at him with wide eyes as she rang up his purchases. "I'm sorry about the mess," Henry told her quietly, hearing the tremor in her breathing. "And I'm sorry you had to see that." Outside, Sarah Mitchell was getting out of her car, her face tight with concern. She must have seen Dean's gang fleeing. "Henry, are you all right? What happened?" "A disagreement," Henry said simply. "Nothing to worry about." But Sarah wasn't easily dismissed. She followed him as he wheeled toward home. "I heard what they've been saying about you in town. They're calling you dangerous, a troublemaker." Henry thought about the confrontation, about how easily he could have done real damage if he'd chosen to. "They're not entirely wrong about the dangerous part," he admitted. "But I'm not looking for trouble, never have been." His mind drifted to another memory, teaching hand-to-hand combat to his unit, showing them how to subdue without killing, to end fights without escalating them. The best victory, he'd told them, is the one where everyone walks away. Sarah helped him carry his groceries home, her silence heavy with unasked questions. As they approached his house, they saw Danny sitting on his own porch, watching them with undisguised curiosity. "Did you really beat up Dean's whole gang?" the boy called out, earning a sharp look from his mother. "Danny, that's not something to sound excited about." Henry wheeled up his ramp, considering his answer carefully. "Fighting isn't something to admire, Danny. It's sometimes necessary, but it's never something to celebrate." Inside his house, Henry began putting away his groceries, his movements methodical as he processed the morning's events. The confrontation would change things, escalate them, most likely. Dean's pride wouldn't allow him to let this humiliation stand. He opened his laptop, typing out a detailed report of the incident. His military contacts had asked him to document everything, suggesting this pattern of veteran harassment was part of a larger trend. The grocery store's security cameras would have captured everything, evidence that might prove useful later. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Sarah again, this time alone. "I spoke with some people in, town," she said without preamble. "They're scared of you now, after what happened." "Fear isn't always a bad thing," Henry replied, thinking of how fear had kept him alive in combat zones. "Sometimes it makes people think twice before doing something foolish. Or sometimes it makes them more dangerous," Sarah countered. "Dean's not going to let this go. He can't. His whole reputation is built on being the toughest man around." Henry wheeled himself to his window, looking out at the quiet street. "I know, but running isn't an option. Never has been. Because of pride? Because it never stops with one person." Henry turned to face her. "If I leave, They'll find someone else to target, someone who might not be able to defend themselves. Sarah's expression softened with understanding. You're not just protecting yourself, are you? I learned a long time ago that standing your ground isn't just about personal safety. It's about drawing a line that needs to be drawn. The rest of the day passed quietly, but Henry could feel the tension building in the neighborhood. Cars drove by more slowly, their occupants staring at his house. Phones came out to take pictures when he wheeled down to check his mail. That evening, as the sun set, Henry heard the familiar rumble of engines approaching. He wheeled onto his porch, watching as Dean's truck led a parade of vehicles past his house. Their headlights swept across his property like searchlights, but they didn't stop. This was a show of force, a message that they weren't finished. Henry remained on his porch until the last vehicle passed, their taillights disappearing around the corner. Inside, he moved through his house with practiced efficiency, checking his security measures. The confrontation at the grocery store had been contained, controlled. The next one might not be. As night fell, Henry sat in his darkened living room, cleaning his service pistol. The familiar routine helped him think, plan, prepare. Dean would be gathering reinforcements, trying to restore his damaged reputation. The next confrontation would be bigger, more dangerous. From next door, he heard Sarah's voice calling Danny in for dinner. The boys' laughter carried through the evening air, a reminder of why Henry had chosen this path. Sometimes peace had to be defended, even if the defense itself wasn't peaceful. His phone buzzed with a message from one of his military contacts. Similar incidents reported in 3 other states. Pattern emerging. Stay alert. Henry wheeled to his window, watching the street grow darker. The quiet neighborhood seemed peaceful, but he knew better. Under the surface, tensions were building. Dean's gang would return, stronger and more determined. But Henry Thompson had faced worse odds in worse places. He'd survived firefights and ambushes, protected his unit against impossible odds. This was just another mission, another stand that needed to be taken. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. For now, Henry sat in his darkness, his mind clear, his resolve unshaken. The first shot had been fired in this conflict, but it wouldn't be the last. The question wasn't if Dean's gang would return, but when. And when they did, they would find Henry Thompson ready. Not because he wanted violence, but because sometimes peace had to be earned the hard way. He'd learned that lesson in war, and now he would teach it here, in this quiet town that wasn't so quiet anymore. Outside, crickets chirped in the darkness, and a cool breeze carried the promise of coming storms. Henry Thompson sat quietly in his wheelchair, remembering other battles, other stands. The wheels of conflict had been set in motion, and now they would have to play out to their inevitable conclusion. Let them come, he thought. They would learn what others had learned before them, that underestimating Henry Thompson was a dangerous mistake. A mistake that some had only made once. 3 days had passed since the grocery store confrontation, and Henry could feel the change in the air. The neighborhood watched his house with wary eyes, curtains twitching at every sound. Dean's gang hadn't been seen, but their absence spoke louder than their presence. They were planning something. Henry wheeled through his house in the pre-dawn light, checking his security preparations. Hidden cameras covered every approach to his property, their feeds displaying on monitors in his study. Thin tripwires, nearly invisible, ran across strategic points in his yard. Smoke grenades, non-lethal but effective, were positioned where they could provide cover if needed. As he worked, his mind drifted to a mission in Afghanistan, where he'd set up similar defenses around a forward operating base. The sun had been merciless that day, the air thick with dust and tension. Henry had positioned his team carefully, creating overlapping fields of fire. Remember, he'd told them, defense isn't just about stopping an attack. It's about making them think twice about attacking at all. Now, years later, those same principles guided his preparations. Each measure was designed not just for protection, but for psychological impact. He wanted Dean's gang to understand they We're dealing with someone who thought steps ahead. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Sarah stood there holding a newspaper. "Have you seen this?" she asked, handing it to him. The local paper's headline read, "Tensions rise after veteran's violent outburst." Henry scanned the article, noting how it painted him as the aggressor, downplaying Dean's gang's harassment. "They're trying to control the narrative," he said quietly. "The whole town's talking about it," Sarah said. "Some people are saying you're dangerous, that you're going to snap and hurt someone. Others," she hesitated, "others are glad someone finally stood up to Dean." Henry wheeled to his window, watching Danny play in the yard next door. Sometimes standing up to a bully means being painted as one yourself. His mind flashed to another memory, this one more recent. He'd been training new recruits, teaching them the psychological aspects of combat. "Your reputation," he'd explained, "can be a weapon or a weakness. Learn to use it, but never let it use you." A car engine roared past his house, not Dean's gang, but someone wanting to imitate them. The grocery store incident had sparked something in the town's younger population. Some saw Dean's humiliation as an opportunity, others as a call to action. Henry turned back to Sarah. "Things are going to get worse before they get better." "What do you mean?" "Dean's pride was hurt. He'll want revenge, but he'll want it on his terms. He's gathering support, building his numbers." Henry's tactical mind laid out the likely scenarios. "He'll want to make an example of me." Sarah's face paled. "You need to call the police." "The police?" Henry shook his head. "Sheriff Taylor had coffee with Dean yesterday. They're not going to help." The rest of the morning passed quietly as Henry continued his preparations. He cleaned his sniper rifle, though he hoped he wouldn't need it. The familiar routine brought back another memory. He'd been in position for 3 days, watching a high-value target through his scope. The shot would be difficult, over a mile, with tricky wind conditions. But what made it truly challenging was the need for absolute precision. Any mistake could cost innocent lives. Hour after hour, he'd maintained his focus, calculating and recalculating every variable. When the moment finally came, his shot had been perfect. One bullet, one target, no collateral damage. It had earned him commendations, but more importantly, it had taught him the value of patience and preparation. The sound of Danny's voice pulled him back to the present. The boy was at his door, holding a tablet. "Mr. Thompson, can you help me with my math homework again?" Henry glanced at his security monitors, then back at Danny's hopeful face. "Come on in. Just remember what I taught you about angles and trajectories." As they worked through the problems, Henry noticed Danny's eyes straying to the security monitors. "Are you afraid?" the boy asked suddenly. Henry considered the question carefully. "Being afraid isn't the problem. It's what you do with that fear. That matters." "Is that what they taught you in the Army?" "They taught me to be prepared, to think ahead, to protect what matters." Henry helped Danny solve another equation. Sometimes the best way to handle fear is to face it with a clear head. Later, that afternoon, Henry received a call from one of his old unit members. "Watch yourself, Hawk," his friend warned. "We're seeing similar patterns across the country. Local gangs targeting veterans, especially minorities. It's organized, but we can't prove it yet." Henry thanked him for the warning and wheeled to his window. The sun was setting, painting the street in long shadows. Perfect conditions for surveillance. He began his evening routine, checking cameras and testing equipment. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You should have stayed away, cripple. This is your last chance." Henry deleted the message without responding. Threats were meant to provoke fear or anger, emotions that could cloud judgment. He'd learned long ago to channel such feelings into preparation instead. A memory surfaced of his last mission before the injury that put him in the wheelchair. The intel had been solid, but something felt wrong. Henry had watched through his scope as his target moved through the compound. Everything matched the briefing, but his instinct screamed danger. He'd called for a delay, trusting his gut. Hours later, they discovered the compound was rigged with explosives. His caution had saved his entire unit. The mission was completed the next day, but the lesson stayed with him. Always trust your instincts. Now those same instincts were telling him Dean's next move would come soon. The gang leader had been too quiet, too patient. He was planning something big. Sarah brought dinner over that evening, her face tight with worry. I heard Dean's been recruiting from the next town over, bringing in people with records. I know, Henry replied. They've been watching the house. He nodded toward one of his monitors, showing a car parked 2 blocks away. The occupants had been photographing his property for hours. How can you be so calm about this? Henry smiled. Slightly. Because being anything else wouldn't help. He turned his chair to face her fully. Sarah, I want you to take Danny and visit your sister for a few days. What? Why? Because when they make their move, I don't want you or Danny anywhere near here. Sarah stared at him for a long moment. You're really preparing for a fight, aren't you? I'm preparing for whatever comes, Henry corrected. But I'd rather be over-prepared than surprised. After Sarah left, Henry returned to his preparations. He moved ammunition to strategic points throughout the house, each cache easily accessible from his chair. Backup communications were tested and ready. Every approach to his property was covered by cameras and sensors. Another memory surfaced as he worked. He'd been teaching advanced combat tactics to Special Forces units. Your greatest advantage, he'd told them, is the enemy's underestimation. Let them think they have you figured out. Let them think they know your capabilities. Then show them how wrong they are. A message from his military contact interrupted his thoughts. Satellite imagery shows increased activity at known gathering spots. Whatever they're planning, it's big. Stay sharp, Hawk. Henry wheeled to his window, watching the street grow dark. In the distance, he could hear engines revving, Dean's gang marking their territory, trying to intimidate him. But intimidation only worked if you let it. He moved through his house one final time, checking every security measure. His sniper rifle was cleaned and ready, though he hoped it wouldn't come to that. Non-lethal options were his preference: smoke grenades, flashbangs, deterrents rather than weapons. The night settled around him as he took up position in his study. From here, he could monitor every approach to his property. The windows were reinforced, the doors secured. Everything was in place. His phone buzzed with a final message from Sarah. We're leaving now. Please be careful. Henry smiled slightly at the concern in her words. In his mind, another memory played. He'd been recovering in the hospital after the injury that put him in the wheelchair. The doctors had told him he'd never be the same, never be as capable as he once was. They'd been right about the first part, wrong about the second. During rehabilitation, he'd rebuilt himself. Every movement, every action was relearned and adapted. His upper body became strong enough to compensate for his useless legs. His mind became sharper, more focused. He wasn't the same. He was better in ways they hadn't anticipated. Now, years later, those adaptations would serve him well. Dean and his gang thought his wheelchair made him vulnerable. They would learn differently. The quiet of the night was broken by distant engine sounds. Henry checked his monitors, noting increased activity on the outskirts of town. They were gathering, preparing. The confrontation was coming, but Henry Thompson was ready. His mind was clear, his preparations complete. Let them come with their numbers and their anger. They would find him prepared as he had been prepared in war zones across the world. Outside, crickets chirped in the darkness and a cool breeze carried the promise of coming conflict. Henry sat quietly in his chair, watching his monitors, waiting. The calm before the storm was familiar territory for a sniper. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. But tonight, Henry Thompson was in his element, patient, prepared, ready. Dean's gang thought they were hunting him, but they didn't understand. In all his years as a sniper, Henry had never been the hunter. He had always been the one who waited. The attack came at midnight. Bricks crashed through Henry's windows, shattering the quiet night with explosive force. Glass rained onto hardwood floors as voices filled the darkness, shouting threats and slurs. But Henry wasn't there. From his position in the darkened study, He watched through security feeds as Dean's gang surrounded his house. They were bolder tonight, fueled by numbers and alcohol. New faces mixed with the familiar, rougher men brought in from neighboring towns, their expressions hungry for violence. Henry counted 15 in total, more than he'd anticipated. Dean had been busy recruiting. "Come out, you crippled bastard." Dean's voice carried over the sound of breaking glass. "Time to finish what we started." Henry remained motionless in his wheelchair, his trained eyes scanning the monitors. His finger rested near a button that would activate the first set of defensive measures, but not yet. Timing was everything. His mind flashed to a firefight in Kandahar, where patience had saved his entire unit. They'd been pinned down, taking fire from multiple directions. The young soldiers wanted to return fire immediately, but Henry had made them wait. "Let them show their hand first," he'd said. When the enemy finally exposed their position, Henry's single shot had turned the tide. Now, years later, the same principle applied. Let them commit to their attack. Let them think they had the advantage. A crash from the front of the house pulled him back to the present. They'd broken down his door, their footsteps thundering through his home. Henry pressed the button. Smoke filled the first floor, billowing from carefully placed grenades. Confusion erupted as the gang members stumbled in the thick haze, their shouts turning from anger to alarm. "What the hell? I can't see. He's got the place rigged." Henry wheeled silently through a side passage he'd prepared, his movements practiced and precise. The smoke was harmless but disorienting, designed to create chaos rather than injury. Through his night vision goggles, he watched the intruders stumble and collide with each other. Another memory surfaced as he moved. He'd been teaching urban warfare tactics to special forces teams. "Confusion is a weapon," he'd explained. "When you can't match their numbers, change the battlefield instead." Dean's voice cut through the chaos, trying to restore order. "Spread out. Find him." Henry activated the second phase of his defense. Strobe lights burst to life, their pulsing glare amplified by the smoke. The combination was overwhelming, sending several men staggering toward the exits. From his new position, Henry could see Dean pushing further into the house, a baseball bat gripped in his hands. Two of his more experienced men flanked him, their movements suggesting military or law enforcement training. These would be the dangerous ones. Henry keyed his radio, sending a pre-recorded message through hidden speakers. "Multiple hostiles detected. Armed response authorized. Lethal force protocols." Engaged. The effect was immediate. Several of the younger gang members fled, their bravado shattered by the suggestion of military-grade security. But Dean and his core group pressed on, more cautious now but still advancing. "It's just tricks," Dean shouted. "He's trying to scare us." Henry watched through his cameras as they searched room by room. Their movements were sloppy, undisciplined. All except for those two trained men. They cleared corners professionally, their eyes scanning for threats. Another memory clicked into place. During his recovery, he'd spent months studying close-quarters combat from a wheelchair. His instructors had been skeptical at first, but Henry had shown them how his chair could become an advantage rather than a limitation. Now those lessons would be put to the test. He triggered the next set of defenses. Pre-positioned speakers began playing recorded sounds, footsteps, whispered commands, the rack of weapons being loaded. The audio moved through the house in a pattern, drawing attention away from his actual location. One of the trained men spoke quietly to Dean. "This is wrong, boss. He's got this place wired like a military compound. We should pull back." "No." Dean's face was contorted with rage and fear. "He's just one crippled man. Find him." Henry watched them split up, their formation breaking down. Perfect. He keyed his radio again, this time broadcasting his own voice through the speakers. "Last warning." His voice echoed through the smoke-filled house. "Leave now." A burst of gunfire answered him. Wild shots fired into walls and ceiling. Henry shook his head. Exactly what he'd expected. Fear made men predictable. He wheeled silently toward the kitchen, where 3 gang members were arguing about which way to go. His chair made no sound on the hardwood floors. One advantage of military-grade equipment over standard wheelchairs. First man never saw him coming. Henry's chair spun in a practice move. his arm striking out at knee level. The man went down with a cry of pain. The second turned, raising a knife, but Henry was already moving again. His experience in close-quarters combat showed as he used his chair's momentum to disarm and disable. The third man fled, leaving his companions groaning on the floor. From somewhere above, glass shattered. They'd found a way to the second floor. Desperate now, searching room by room, Henry smiled slightly. Let them waste time up there. His real position was elsewhere. Another memory surfaced. He'd been training snipers in urban environments. Control the space, he'd taught them. Make them fight where you want them to fight, not where they want to. Henry wheeled to his prepared position in the study. 3 monitors showed different angles of his house, while a fourth displayed the police scanner. No calls yet. The neighbors were staying quiet, just as they had during weeks of harassment. Through the smoke and strobes, he watched Dean and his remaining men growing more frustrated. They'd expected an easy target, a disabled man they could overwhelm with numbers. Instead, they'd found themselves fighting an unseen opponent who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. "Come out and face us," Dean shouted, his voice cracking with strain. "Stop hiding behind your tricks." Henry triggered another set of smoke grenades, filling new sections of the house with thick clouds. On his monitors, he watched the gang's formation deteriorate further as men stumbled through the haze. One of the trained men suddenly stopped, his head tilting. "Listen." In the relative quiet, police sirens could be heard in the distance. Someone had finally called them, probably not out of concern for Henry, but fear of what the gang might do next. "Boss, we need to go." The trained man grabbed Dean's arm. "Cops are coming!" Dean shook him off, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. "Not without teaching him a lesson!" Henry watched through his cameras as the gang began to splinter. The smarter ones fled immediately, while others hesitated, torn between fear of arrest and loyalty to Dean. Another memory rose in Henry's mind. It was after a particularly difficult mission, debriefing his team. "The most dangerous moment," he'd told them, "is when your enemy realizes they've lost. That's when they're most likely to do something desperate." As if proving his point, Dean suddenly turned and fired his pistol wildly into the smoke. "Where are you, you coward? Face me!" The shots went wide, embedding themselves in walls and furniture. Henry noted the positions for later evidence collection. Every moment of this encounter was being recorded from multiple angles. He keyed his radio one final time. "It's over, Dean. Police are almost here. How do you want this to end?" The gang leader's response was another burst of gunfire, more desperate than the last. But his men were already retreating, slipping away into the night as sirens grew closer. Henry watched Dean spinning in the smoke, searching for a target, his control completely shattered. The man who'd terrorized the town for so long now looked small and afraid. Moving silently through his own home, Henry positioned himself behind Dean. "Put the gun down," Dean whirled, firing blindly. The shot went wide as Henry's chair moved with practiced precision. Before Dean could fire again, Henry struck. One precise blow that sent the weapon skittering across the floor. "You," Dean staggered back, his bravado crumbling as he finally faced Henry alone. "What are you?" "Just a man who's seen enough bullies." Henry's voice was calm. "The police will be here in 30 seconds. Your friends are gone. It's over." Dean's legs gave out, and he sat heavily on the floor, his face a mask of confusion and fear. "I don't understand. You're in a wheelchair. You're supposed to be weak, helpless, sorry to disappoint." Henry wheeled back slightly as red and blue lights began flashing through broken windows. 20 years in Special Forces teaches you a few things, like how to deal with men who mistake kindness for weakness. Police burst through the door, weapons drawn. Henry raised his hands calmly, his posture relaxed. "Officers, this man and his associates broke into my home. I have video evidence of the entire incident." Dean was handcuffed and led away, his earlier rage replaced by stunned silence. As police began securing the scene, Henry surveyed the damage to his home. Broken glass and spent smoke grenades littered the floor. Bullet holes pocked the walls, but his preparations had worked. No one had been seriously injured. Sheriff Taylor arrived, his face tight with suppressed anger. "This is going to make things complicated, Thompson." "Only if you make them complicated." Henry replied evenly. "Everything that happened here tonight is documented, including which of your deputies were involved." The sheriff's face paled slightly. "What are you talking about?" Two of Dean's men had tactical training. One moved like law enforcement. "Small town like this, I'm guessing he works for you." Henry's voice remained calm. "That evidence is already uploaded to secure servers, just so you know." Dawn was breaking by the time the police finally left. Henry wheeled through his damaged home, assessing what needed to be repaired. The physical damage could be fixed. The message he'd sent would last longer. His phone buzzed, a text from Sarah. "Are you okay? We heard what happened." "I'm fine," he replied. "Just some cleanup needed. You and Danny can come home tomorrow." Setting down his phone, Henry looked at Maria's picture on the mantel, somehow untouched by the night's violence. "It ended the way it had to end, honey," he said softly. "Sometimes peace has to be earned the hard way." Outside, birds began their morning songs, untroubled by the night's events. Henry Thompson sat in his wheelchair, watching the sun rise over his battered but undefeated home. The battle was over, but he knew the war for acceptance and respect would continue. Let it come, he thought. He'd faced worse odds in worse places, and he never missed his mark. 3 days after the attack on his home, Henry watched through his security cameras as unfamiliar vehicles gathered at the edge of town. His police scanner crackled with unusual radio silence from the sheriff's department. The signs were clear. Dean's remaining followers were planning something big. Released on bail through the sheriff's questionable influence, Dean had spent the past days gathering reinforcements. Henry's military contacts confirmed that known troublemakers from 3 neighboring counties were converging on the area. This wouldn't be like the previous attack. This would be organized. Henry wheeled through his repaired home, checking his preparations. The broken windows had been replaced. With bulletproof glass, the damaged doors reinforced with steel cores. New security cameras covered every angle of approach, their feeds displaying on a bank of monitors in his study. His mind drifted to a mission in Iraq, where he'd had to defend a strategic position against superior numbers. The insurgents had thought numbers would overwhelm his small unit. Instead, his carefully planned defenses had turned their own force against them. The larger the force, he'd told his men, the harder it is to coordinate. Use that. Now, years later, he applied those same principles. His security feeds showed at least 20 vehicles gathering, carrying close to 40 men. Dean was visible, among them gesturing angrily as he laid out his plan. Henry's phone buzzed, a message from Sarah. "Police scanners going crazy with coded messages. Something's happening." "Stay inside," he texted back. "Keep Danny away from windows." He wheeled to his position in the study, where he had clear views of all approaches to his property. Multiple screens showed thermal imaging of the surrounding area, revealing figures trying to move stealthily through neighboring yards. Another memory surfaced as he watched their amateur attempts at tactical movement. He'd been training special forces in counter-ambush techniques. The most dangerous ambush, he'd taught them, is the one your enemy thinks you don't see coming. Henry activated his first line of defense. Hidden speakers throughout the neighborhood began playing recorded sounds of police sirens approaching from multiple directions. Through his cameras, he watched several of Dean's men dive for cover, their coordination already breaking down. "It's a trick," Dean's voice carried through the evening air. "The cops are on our side. Move in." Henry smiled slightly. Dean's words were being recorded, along with the faces and license plates of everyone involved. The evidence would be damning. Not just for Dean, but for the corrupt local law enforcement enabling him. The gang began their approach, splitting into groups to surround the house. They moved with false confidence, believing their numbers guaranteed victory. Henry watched them walk into his prepared kill zone, their movements tracked by multiple cameras. His finger hovered over a control panel as the first group reached his property line. Not yet. Let them commit fully to the attack. Through his thermal imaging, he could see 3 men trying to flank around the back of the house. Their movement patterns marked them as the same trained men from before, probably off-duty deputies. They, at least, understood tactical movement. Henry keyed his radio, broadcasting through hidden speakers. This property is protected by automated defense systems. Lethal force authorized. The effect was immediate. Several men froze, while others looked around nervously for automated weapons. Henry had counted on their uncertainty, their inability to distinguish truth from tactical deception. "He's bluffing," Dean shouted, but his voice carried an edge of doubt. "Move in!" Henry triggered his first active defense. Pressure plates hidden in his lawn activated, sending geysers of colored smoke into the air. The non-toxic but distinctive powder would mark everyone it touched, evidence that would be impossible to wash away quickly. Confusion erupted as men stumbled through the smoke clouds. Their formations broke down further, turning their numerical advantage into chaos. Through his cameras, Henry watched Dean trying to restore order, his face purple with rage. Another memory clicked into place. During urban warfare training, he'd emphasized the importance of controlling the battlefield. "Don't fight them where they are," he'd taught. "Make them fight where you want them to be." Henry activated his second layer of defenses. Hidden speakers began broadcasting recorded military communications, creating the illusion of a large force moving through the darkness. The more inexperienced gang members began to panic, shooting at shadows. "Hold your position," one of the trained men shouted. "It's all smoke and mirrors." But Henry was already implementing the next phase of his plan. Motion sensors triggered bright floodlights, momentarily blinding anyone looking in the wrong direction. In the confusion, more men broke ranks and fled. Through his thermal imaging, Henry watched the three trained men moving more cautiously now. They recognized his tactics for what they were, military-grade psychological warfare. But recognition didn't make the tactics less effective. He keyed his radio again, this time broadcasting directly to them. To the three men approaching from the east, "Your police training is obvious. Think carefully about your next moves. Everything is being recorded." The men froze, their heat signatures showing their hesitation. One immediately turned and walked away, unwilling to risk his career. The other two continued their advance, but their movements had lost conviction. Dean's voice cut through the chaos, higher-pitched now with desperation. "He's alone. He's trapped. Don't let him mind-fuck you." Henry waited until the remaining forces had committed fully to their advance. Then he triggered his final defensive measure. Every exterior light on his property burst to life simultaneously, bright as daylight, while hidden smoke grenades created a dense barrier around the house. Through his cameras, he watched the gang's formation completely dissolve. Men collided, with each other in the smoke, some firing blindly in panic. Others simply ran, their courage evaporating in the face of an enemy they couldn't see or understand. The two remaining trained men tried to maintain discipline, but they were fighting blind now. Henry's thermal imaging showed them moving cautiously through the smoke, but their tactical advantage was gone. Another memory surfaced. He'd been teaching advanced sniper tactics. "Sometimes," he'd explained, "the best shot is the one you don't have to take. Make them defeat themselves." Henry wheeled to his front door, watching through cameras as Dean stood alone in his front yard, abandoned by his followers. "This king." Leader's face showed a mix of fury and fear as he realized how completely his plan had unraveled. "Come out and face me," Dean screamed, firing his pistol wildly into the smoke. "Fight me like a man." "Put the gun down, Dean." Henry's voice came from hidden speakers, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Your men are gone. Police are on their way. Real police this time, from the state level. Think about what happens next." "Fuck you," Dean fired again, emptying his magazine into the smoke. When he reached for a fresh clip, his hands were shaking. "You can't hide forever." "I'm not hiding," Henry said, opening his front door. His wheelchair framed in the doorway, lights behind him casting his shadow long across the lawn. "I never was." Dean raised his gun, but the night's events had shattered his nerve. The shot went wide, and before he could fire again, the sound of genuine police sirens filled the air. "Last chance," Henry said calmly. "Drop the gun and walk away, or try to explain to state police why you're shooting at a disabled veteran on his own property." The gun slipped from Dean's fingers as the fight drained out of him. He sank to his knees in the smoke-stained grass, his carefully planned assault ending not with a bang, but with a whimper. State police vehicles surrounded the property, their lights painting the smoke clouds in red and blue. Officers emerged with weapons drawn, but Henry had already transmitted video evidence of the entire incident to their headquarters. Inside the house, you'll find proof of conspiracy between local law enforcement and Dean's gang, Henry told the state police captain, including audio of the sheriff coordinating tonight's attack. The captain nodded grimly. We've been building a case against corruption in this department. Your evidence will help. As Dean was led away in handcuffs, Henry wheeled back into his house. Through his cameras, he watched state police rounding up stragglers and photographing evidence. The colored smoke had done its job. Every participant in tonight's attack was literally marked for identification. His phone buzzed with messages from his military contacts, confirming that similar incidents across the country were being investigated. Dean's gang had been part of a larger pattern, but tonight's events would help break that pattern. Sarah's voice called from next door. Henry? Is it over? It's over, he confirmed. You and Danny can come out now. He watched through his cameras as Sarah and Danny emerged from their home. The boy's eyes were wide as he took in the scene. Police cars, colored smoke still drifting across yards, state police photographers documenting everything. Were you scared? Danny asked as they approached. Henry smiled slightly. Being scared is natural, but I was prepared. That's more important than not being afraid. Sarah surveyed the aftermath of the failed assault. How did you know they would try something like this? Because bullies are predictable, Henry replied. When they lose power, they either break completely or try one desperate grab to get it back. Dean chose the second option. As the state police continued their investigation, Henry sent the night's surveillance footage to secure servers. Everything had been documented. The planning, the assault, the coordination with corrupt officials. The evidence would ensure this night had consequences beyond just Dean's arrest. His phone buzzed one final time, a message from his old commanding officer. Good work, Hawk. You just helped break open a national investigation. Same pattern in 12 states. Your evidence connects the dots. Henry wheeled to his window, watching the last police cars depart. The neighborhood would talk about this night for years to come, but they would miss the most important lesson. It hadn't been about strength or violence or even justice. It had been about preparation, patience, and the courage to stand your ground. A memory rose in his mind. The last lesson he'd taught his sniper unit before retiring. The best victory, he'd told them, isn't the one where you defeat your enemy. It's the one where you change their ability to be your enemy. Now, years later, he'd proved those words true again. Dean's gang was finished, their leader arrested, their corruption exposed. But more importantly, they'd been shown the futility of their hatred and fear. Outside, the sun was rising over his smoke-stained lawn. Birds began their morning songs, indifferent to the night's events. Henry Thompson sat in his wheelchair, watching the new day dawn on a neighborhood forever changed. Let them remember this night, he thought. Let them remember that strength comes in many forms, that courage wears many faces, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the mind that guides the response. In his study, Maria's picture caught the morning light. Henry wheeled over to it, adjusting its angle slightly. Well, honey, he whispered, I think we've found our peace, even if we had to fight for it. The neighborhood was quiet now, the silence of meaningful change rather than fearful submission. Henry Thompson sat in his wheelchair, content in the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victories are won not by the shots you take, but by the ones you never have to fire. The morning after Dean's failed assault, Henry sat alone in his study, surrounded by the aftermath of victory. The sun filtered through bulletproof windows, casting long shadows across floors still dusted with smoke residue. On his security monitors, he watched state police teams photographing evidence scattered across his property, spent smoke grenades, bullet casings, footprints in colored powder. For the first time since the confrontation began, Henry felt the weight of everything settle onto his shoulders. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up a framed photo of his old sniper unit. 20 years of combat had taught him that the hardest moments often came after the fighting ended, when the adrenaline faded and the mind had time to process. A memory surfaced, unbidden. His first combat mission as a sniper. The shot had been clean, necessary, justified. But later, alone in his bunk, his hands had shaken just like they did now. His commanding officer had found him there. "It's not the action that haunts us," the older man had said. "It's the weight of knowing we're capable of it." Now, years later, those words rang true again. Henry had won, decisively, completely. Dean's gang was scattered, their leader in custody, their corruption exposed. But victory carried its own burden. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Sarah stood there, her face etched with concern. "I brought coffee," she said, holding up a thermos. "And company." Danny peeked around her legs, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and admiration. Henry wheeled back from his desk, making space for them. "Come in. Though I should warn you, it's still a mess in here." Danny moved immediately to the windows, pressing his face against the glass to look at the state police teams outside. "Did you really fight all those bad guys by yourself?" "Danny!" Sarah's voice carried a mother's warning, but Henry raised his hand. "It's a fair question." He wheeled closer to Danny. "The truth is, I didn't fight them at all. I just showed them that fighting wasn't the answer they thought it was." Sarah poured coffee into cups she'd brought, her hands steady but her voice shaking slightly. "The whole town's talking about what happened. Some people are saying—" She hesitated. "What are they saying?" "That you're dangerous, that someone with your abilities shouldn't be living here." She met his eyes. "Others are saying you're a hero." Henry took a sip of coffee, considering his response. "They're all wrong. I'm just a man who didn't want to run anymore." His mind drifted to another memory. Training. New recruits in Afghanistan. One had asked him what made a good soldier. "Not the ability to fight," he'd answered, "but the wisdom to know when fighting isn't the answer." A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the windows, they could see members of Dean's former gang being led away by state police. Some looked defeated, others angry, but most just looked lost. Foot soldiers, without a leader. "What'll happen to them?" Danny asked. Henry watched the men who had tried to drive him from his home. "They'll face consequences, but more importantly, they'll have to face themselves. Sometimes that's the harder punishment." Sarah touched his arm gently. "Are you okay? Really?" The question hit harder than he expected. Henry felt emotions he'd kept controlled for days finally start to surface. His voice caught. "I never wanted this. Any of it." In his mind, another memory played. The hospital room after the injury that put him in the wheelchair. Maria sitting beside him, holding his hand. "You're still you," she'd said. "Different doesn't mean less." Henry wheeled to his living room, Sarah and Danny following. Maria's picture sat on the mantel, untouched by the previous night's chaos. He stared at her smile, remembering her strength. "When I moved here," he said quietly, "I thought I was done fighting, done proving myself. Maria, my wife, she always said that peace was something you had to choose every day." Danny moved, closer to the picture. "Is that your wife? Where is she?" "Danny, don't—" Sarah started. "She died," Henry said gently. "Cancer. She fought harder than I ever did, but some battles can't be won with strategy or skill." The room fell quiet, broken only by the distant sound of police radios outside. Henry felt tears threatening for the first time since the confrontation began. Not for the victory or the violence, but for the simple human connection he'd thought he'd lost. His phone buzzed, a message from his old unit commander. "Just saw the footage. You did good, Hawk. But how are you holding up?" Henry stared at the message, remembering another lesson from his military days. After a particularly difficult mission, his commander had gathered the unit. "The hardest part of being a warrior," he'd said, "isn't the fighting. It's remembering how to be human afterward." Sarah seemed to sense his struggle. "The church is organizing a community meeting. Tonight, people want to understand what happened, what's been happening." Are you going to tell them? Danny asked, his young face serious. Henry looked at the boy who had somehow become important to him during these troubled days. What should I tell them? The truth, Danny said simply. That's what you taught me about math. The answer is always there if you're honest about the numbers. A surprised laugh escaped Henry, the first genuine laugh in days. When did you get so wise? Sarah smiled at her son, then turned back to Henry. He's right, though. People need to hear your story. The real story, not the rumors. Through his security feeds, Henry watched more townspeople gathering at the police lines, their faces showing a mix of emotions: fear, curiosity, shame. Some had been silent witnesses to weeks of harassment. Others had actively spread rumors, and suspicion. Another memory surfaced. Teaching conflict resolution to peacekeeping forces. The hardest victory, he told them, is winning over minds that have already decided to fear you. Maybe you're both right, Henry said finally. Maybe it's time for truth. As if in response, his phone buzzed with messages from other veterans, men and women who had faced similar harassment in other towns. They'd heard about his stand, about the evidence he'd gathered. They wanted advice, support, hope. Henry wheeled to his window, watching the state police begin to dismantle their evidence markers. The colored powder that had marked his attackers was being photographed and documented, proving who had been there, who had chosen violence over understanding. Will you come with me? He asked Sarah. To the meeting. She squeezed his shoulder gently. Of course. Danny too, if you want. Yeah. Danny's face lit up. I can tell them about how you taught me math. Henry smiled, feeling some of the weight lift from his shoulders. This was what Maria had always talked about. Not just choosing peace, but building it through connection and understanding. His phone buzzed again, this time with news that shook him. Dean had been found dead in his cell, an apparent suicide. The man's final note spoke of shame, of realizing too late the emptiness of his hatred. Henry closed his eyes, another memory washing over him. His last day of active duty, turning in his sniper rifle. The hardest targets, he'd told his replacement, are the ones you have to save, not shoot. Henry? Sarah's voice brought him back. What is it? Dean's dead, he said quietly. Couldn't live with losing everything he thought made him strong. Sarah's hand found his shoulder again as Danny moved closer to his chair, offering silent support. Outside, the town continued to gather, waiting for answers, for understanding, for a way forward. Henry thought about the community meeting, about sharing his story, not just the military parts, but all of it. The loss of Maria, the choice to seek peace, the necessity of standing firm without seeking revenge. You know what the hardest part was? He said suddenly. Not the fighting, not even the planning. It was staying human through all of it, remembering that they were human too, even when they forgot it themselves. Danny looked up at him. Is that why you didn't hurt them, even when they tried to hurt you? Henry nodded, surprised again by the boy's insight. Violence is easy. Understanding is harder. Your mother taught you that, I bet. Sarah smiled tearfully. I try. Though lately, he's learning more from you than me. Through his security feeds, Henry watched the crowd outside growing. He recognized faces, people who had turned away from him in the grocery store, others who had whispered behind his back. But he also saw something new in their expressions. Respect, shame, hope. Another memory rose in his mind. Maria in their garden, planting flowers. Everything grows, she'd said, if you give it light and time. Henry wheeled to his door, Sarah and Danny beside him. Outside, the autumn sun painted the sky in shades of hope. State police were removing the last evidence markers, their work thorough and professional. Ready? Sarah asked softly. Henry looked at the crowd waiting for answers, at the town that had tried to reject him, at the community that now needed to heal. Ready, he said. It's time to grow something new here. As they moved toward the gathered townspeople, Henry felt Maria's presence in his heart. She had always believed in the power of truth, in the possibility of change. Now he would honor that belief. The crowd parted as he approached, their whispers carrying a new tone. Not fear or hatred, but something closer to awe and regret. Henry Thompson, the man they had tried to drive away, had become the mirror in which they saw their own humanity reflected. Let them learn, he thought. Let them understand that strength comes in many forms, that courage wears many faces, and that the hardest battles are won not with weapons, but with wisdom. The future would bring what it would bring. But for now, Henry Thompson rolled forward to face his community, ready to build something stronger than fear, more lasting than hate. Peace, after all, was something you had to choose every day. Night fell over the town like a heavy blanket, bringing with it an eerie silence. Henry sat in his darkened study, monitoring his security feeds as the last remnants of Dean's gang gathered for what he knew would be their final stand. Despite Dean's death, or perhaps because of it, they were determined to finish what they'd started. His police scanner crackled with encrypted chatter. The corrupt officers were making their final play too. They knew state investigators were closing in, that tomorrow would bring questions they couldn't answer. Tonight was their last, chance to bury the truth. Through his thermal cameras, Henry counted the heat signatures gathering in the shadows. 23 men, more heavily armed than before, their movements showing greater discipline. The corrupt officers had taken direct command now, bringing military-grade weapons and tactical experience to the assault. A memory surfaced as he watched their preparations, his last combat mission before the injury. The enemy had been desperate, cornered, willing to risk everything on one final attack. Those were always the most dangerous moments, when your opponent had nothing left to lose. Henry's phone buzzed with a message from his military contacts. State police delayed by roadblocks, at least 30 minutes out. You're on your own. He smiled slightly, remembering another lesson from his combat days. A sniper is always on his own, he'd told his trainees. The trick is making the enemy feel more alone than you are. Henry activated his first defensive measure. Hidden speakers throughout the neighborhood began broadcasting random movement sounds, making his opponents question every shadow. Through his cameras, he watched their formation tighten nervously. "Don't let him get in your heads," former Deputy Rogers shouted to his men. "He's just one man." "So was I," Henry whispered to himself, triggering his next sequence of defenses. Smoke. Grenades detonated at strategic points, creating corridors of visibility that forced the attackers to move where he wanted them. The corrupt officers recognized the tactic but couldn't counter it. They were committed now, their desperation making them predictable. His thermal imaging showed 3 teams trying to flank his position. They moved with professional precision, but Henry had anticipated their approach. Motion sensors triggered sequences of lights and sounds, disrupting their night vision and communication. Another memory clicked into place, training elite units in psychological warfare. The mind is the first battlefield, he'd taught them. Win there and the physical fight becomes secondary. Henry keyed his radio, broadcasting through hidden speakers. "Last warning, drop your weapons and leave. State police have satellite coverage of this area. Everything is being recorded." He watched through his cameras as several men hesitated, looking to their leaders for guidance. Former Deputy Rogers fired a burst into the air. "He's bluffing! Move in!" Henry activated his next layer of defense. Every exterior light on his property burst to life simultaneously, while hidden smoke grenades created a dense colored barrier. The non-toxic but distinctive powder would mark everyone it touched, evidence that would be impossible to deny later. Through his thermal imaging, he watched the assault team's formation break apart as men stumbled through the smoke. Their military discipline began to crack as confusion set in. "Where is he?" "I can't see." "Watch your sectors." Henry wheeled silently through his house, moving between prepared positions. Each window was reinforced, each angle covered by cameras and non-lethal defenses. He'd turned his home into a fortress, but more importantly, he'd turned it into a stage where he controlled every act of the unfolding drama. His radio crackled with Roger's voice, trying to coordinate his men. "Team 2, breach the back door. Team 3, cover the windows. He's in here somewhere." Henry smiled sadly, another memory surfacing. teaching advanced tactical response. Your enemy's greatest weakness, he'd explained, is believing they understand your capabilities. He triggered his next sequence. Pre-recorded sounds of movement echoed through the house while strobing lights created disorienting shadows. Through his cameras, he watched the assault teams bunch up, their training forgotten as uncertainty took hold. A crash from the back of the house told him they'd breached a door. Henry waited, listening to their footsteps echo through his halls. Their movement patterns told him everything. Which ones had real training, which were just playing soldier. "Clear the rooms," Rogers shouted. "Find him!" Henry activated more smoke grenades, filling corridors with colored powder. On his thermal cameras, he watched the teams separate, losing cohesion as they searched empty rooms. Another memory rose in his mind. His first firefight after losing the use of his legs. Everyone had thought him vulnerable, unable to defend himself. They'd learned differently. Henry wheeled to his planned position, watching through cameras as Rogers led a team toward his location. Their movements were cautious now, uncertain. They'd expected to find a disabled man hiding in fear. Instead, they'd found themselves trapped in a tactical nightmare. Room clear. Nothing here. Where the hell is he? The frustration in their voices told Henry it was time. He triggered his final defensive sequence. Every speaker in the house activated simultaneously, playing a carefully prepared message. "Attention all units. This is State Police Command. We have the area surrounded. All civilians clear the area immediately. Tactical teams moving in." The effect was instantaneous. Through his cameras, Henry watched as the less committed attackers broke ranks, fleeing into the night. Rogers tried to restore order, but panic was contagious. "Stand your ground," the former deputy screamed. "It's a trick." But his words had lost their power. Men were running now, leaving weapons behind as they fled the colored smoke that marked them as participants in the assault. Henry wheeled to his front door, watching through cameras as Rogers and his core team found themselves increasingly alone. The former deputy's face showed the desperation of a man watching his world collapse. "Come out and face us," Rogers shouted, firing wildly into the smoke. "Face us like a man." A man, Henry's voice came through hidden speakers, knows when to stand and when to walk away. "It's over, Rogers. The real state police will be here in 10 minutes. What they find is up to you." He watched through his cameras as Rogers spun in the smoke, trying to locate the source of his voice. The other corrupt officers were backing away now, their survival instincts finally overriding their desperation. "You don't understand," Rogers called out, his voice cracking. "We had to maintain order, had to keep people in their place." "Their place?" Henry replied calmly. "Like where I belonged. Tell me, deputy, what place did you think that was?" The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, real ones this time. Rogers fired another burst blindly, but his shots went wide, his hands shaking with fear and rage. "Last chance," Henry broadcast. "State police will be here in 5 minutes. Choose your next move carefully." Through his thermal imaging, he watched the last of Rogers' men abandon him. The former deputy stood alone in the colored smoke, his weapon hanging limply at his side. Henry opened his front door, his wheelchair framed in the light. "It's over, Rogers. Has been for a while. You just didn't know it." Rogers raised his weapon, one last time, but his hands were trembling too badly to aim. The gun clattered to the ground as the fight drained out of him. "Why?" he asked, his voice small in the smoke-filled night. "Why couldn't you just leave?" "Because running never solved anything," Henry replied. "Sometimes you have to stand your ground even if you can't stand." State police vehicles surrounded the property, their lights cutting through the smoke. Officers moved in with professional efficiency, securing Rogers and beginning to process the scene. Henry provided them with video evidence of the entire assault, including clear footage of every participant. The colored smoke had done its job. Each attacker was literally marked for identification. As dawn broke over the neighborhood, Henry wheeled onto his porch, watching state police teams photograph evidence and take statements. The colored smoke was settling, leaving an undeniable record of who had been there, who had chosen violence over understanding. Sarah and Danny emerged from their home, walking carefully through the police lines. Danny's eyes were wide as he took in the scene, but there was no fear in his expression. Only a child's understanding that sometimes the good guys really did win. "You okay?" Sarah asked softly, touching Henry's shoulder. He nodded, feeling the weight of the night's events. "It's really over this time. They're out of options, out of leaders, out of hate." His phone buzzed with messages from his military contacts, confirming that similar operations were taking place across the country. The evidence he'd gathered had helped expose a nationwide pattern of corruption and targeted harassment. But that was tomorrow's battle. For now, Henry Thompson sat in his wheelchair, watching the sun rise over a neighborhood forever changed. The corrupted officers who had protected Dean's legacy of hate were being led away in handcuffs, their authority stripped, their true nature exposed. A memory rose in his mind, the last lesson he'd taught before retiring from the service. The greatest victory, he told his unit, isn't destroying your enemy. It's showing them a better way. Danny tugged at his sleeve. "Mr. Thompson, can we still do math lessons even though the bad guys are gone?" Henry smiled, feeling the last tension drain from his shoulders. "Of course. Math doesn't care about bad guys or good guys. It just cares about truth." As the morning progressed, neighbors began emerging from their homes. They watched the police activity with a mix of shame and relief. Shame for their silence during weeks of harassment. Relief that the corruption in their town had finally been exposed. Henry's phone buzzed one final time. A message from his old commanding officer. "You did it, Hawk. Your stand here is going to help veterans across the country. Proud of you, soldier." He looked at Maria's picture on his mantle, visible through the open door. "Well, honey," he whispered, "I think we finally found our peace, even if we had to fight for it one last time." Sarah squeezed his shoulder gently. "What happens now?" Henry watched as state police began dismantling their evidence markers, preparing to transition from tactical response to detailed investigation. Now we build something better, something based on understanding instead of fear. The morning sun cast long shadows across his smoke-stained lawn, but they were different shadows now, not ones that hid threats, but ones that marked the beginning of a new day. Let them remember this, Henry thought. Let them remember that strength comes in many forms, that courage wears many faces, and that sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to become what your enemies think you are. The war was over, and Henry Thompson had won it not with bullets, but with wisdom, not with hatred, but with steadfast resolve, not by destroying his enemies, but by showing them a better way. Outside, birds began their morning songs, indifferent to the night's events. Henry Thompson sat in his wheelchair, watching his community begin its journey toward healing, knowing that sometimes peace must be defended before it can truly flourish. The autumn morning dawned clear and crisp, 1 week after the final confrontation. Henry wheeled down his front path, noting how different everything looked in the morning light. State police had finished collecting evidence, leaving behind only faint traces of colored powder that refused to wash away. A subtle reminder of the night that had changed everything. Neighbors who had once hurried inside at his approach now stopped to wave, their faces showing a mix of respect and lingering shame. The hardware store owner, Tom Wilson, was leading a group of volunteers repairing Henry's damaged property, their hammers and saws creating a rhythm of redemption. "Mr. Thompson!" Danny's voice carried across the yard as he ran from his house, clutching a newspaper. "Look, you're in the paper again." Henry took the offered paper, scanning the headline, "Local Veterans Stand Exposes Nationwide Corruption." The article detailed how his evidence had helped uncover similar patterns of harassment in 12 other states, leading to multiple arrests and investigations. Sarah followed her son at a more relaxed pace, carrying 3 cups of coffee. "The whole town's talking about it," she said, handing Henry a cup. "About how much we all missed, how blind we were." A memory surfaced as Henry sipped his coffee. Teaching conflict resolution to his unit. "The hardest part isn't winning," he'd explained, It's helping everyone live with the aftermath. The sound of more vehicles approaching drew their attention. A small convoy of trucks pulled up, led by James Parker, the town council president. Henry watched through old habit as men began unloading building materials and equipment. "Mr. Thompson," Parker called out, approaching with an outstretched hand. "The council voted unanimously. We're here to repair all the damage at the town's expense. It's the least we can do." Henry studied the man who had once avoided eye contact with him at town meetings. "Thank you, but that's not necessary. Insurance will cover it." "Please," Parker's voice cracked slightly. "We need to do this, for ourselves as much as for you." Another memory rose in Henry's mind. After a particularly difficult mission, his commander discussing reconstruction efforts. Sometimes people need to rebuild things with their own hands before they can rebuild their souls. Henry nodded slowly. "All right. But on one condition. The materials get donated to the community center when you're done. They need repairs too." Parker's eyes widened with surprise, then understanding. "Of course. Yes, of course." Throughout the morning, more townspeople arrived to help. Some brought food, others tools, all of them carrying the weight of unspoken apologies. Henry watched from his porch as former enemies became eager allies in the work of reconstruction. His phone buzzed with a message from his military contacts. "Your evidence keeps growing. 28 arrests across 3 states this morning. You started something. Big, Hawk." Sarah settled into a chair beside him, watching Danny help carry lightweight boards. "How does it feel, seeing everything change like this?" Henry considered the question carefully. Change is complicated. It's not just about fixing what's broken. It's about building something better in its place. A pickup truck pulled into his driveway, and Henry recognized 2 of Dean's former gang members, looking uncertain as they stepped out. They carried lumber and tools, their body language showing their discomfort. "Mr. Thompson?" The younger one, Billy Matthews, spoke hesitantly. We wanted to help, if that's okay." Henry studied them, remembering another lesson from his military days, teaching advanced combat psychology. "The bravest thing an enemy can do," he'd told his students, "is admit they were wrong and try to make it right." "Grab some tools," Henry said simply. "There's plenty of work to go around." The men joined the others, awkward at first but gradually finding their place in the rhythm of reconstruction. Henry watched as former battle lines dissolved in the simple act of shared labor. Around noon, more visitors arrived, state investigators who had been working on the broader case. They brought news of additional arrests, of corrupt networks being dismantled across the country. "Your stand here," the lead investigator explained, gave others the courage to come forward. Veterans in 3 other towns have exposed similar harassment campaigns. It's like dominoes falling. Danny, who had been listening nearby, looked up from his sandwich. "Like in math class, when one number changes, it affects all the other numbers." Henry smiled, ruffling the boy's hair. "Exactly like that. Everything's connected." Sarah added her own observation. "The church group is already talking about starting a veteran support program. Reverend Marshall says it's long overdue." Through his security cameras, Henry watched the transformation of his property. The signs of violence were being erased, replaced by evidence of community. Even the lingering colored powder seemed less like a mark of shame and more like a badge of change. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message that made his throat tight. The remains of his old unit were planning a visit, wanting to honor his stand and help with the rebuilding. Another memory surfaced, his last day of active duty, saying goodbye to his team. "Family isn't about who you fight alongside," he'd told them. "It's about who stands with you after the fighting's done." As afternoon stretched toward evening, Henry wheeled through the worksite, offering advice and thanks to the volunteers. He stopped near Billy Matthews, who was carefully repairing a damaged door frame. "Why did you come back?" Henry asked quietly. Billy paused in his work, considering the question. Because you could have hurt us. Could have killed some of us. But you chose not to. Made me think about choices." Henry nodded, understanding. Another memory rose in his mind. Training, snipers and target discrimination. The hardest shot, he'd explained, is the one you choose not to take. Sarah brought more coffee to the workers, her movements confident now among people who had once shunned her for defending Henry. Danny followed with cookies, proudly telling everyone how Mr. Thompson had taught him about angles while they rebuilt the porch steps. As the sun began to set, Henry received another significant visitor. Sheriff Taylor's replacement, a no-nonsense woman named Rachel Martinez, came to discuss community policing reforms. "We're rebuilding the department from the ground up," she explained. "Would you consider serving on our community oversight board? We need people who understand both sides of the law." Henry thought about it, remembering another lesson from his past, teaching ethics to military police. True justice, he'd said, isn't about punishment. It's about restoration. "I'll think about it," he told Martinez. "But first, let's focus on healing what's broken." As darkness fell, the volunteers began packing up for the day. The transformation was remarkable, not just of the property, but of the people themselves. Former enemies worked alongside each other, sharing tools and stories, finding common ground in the act of rebuilding. Henry wheeled to his favorite observation point, watching the last trucks pull away. Sarah and Danny remained, helping to clean up the day's debris. "Will you tell me another story about when you were a soldier?" Danny asked, collecting scattered nails. Henry smiled, choosing his words carefully. "How about instead I tell you about building things? About how your mom stood up for what was right when everyone else looked away?" Sarah blushed at the praise, but Danny's eyes lit up. "Yeah, tell me about the good guys." "The truth is," Henry said, "most people want to be good. Sometimes they just forget how." His phone buzzed one final time for the day, news that made him pause. Dean's family had requested a meeting, wanting to understand and apologize. They'd also offered to establish a foundation supporting veteran integration in small communities. Another memory surfaced, teaching conflict resolution in post-war zones. "Peace isn't just the absence of violence," he'd explained. "It's the presence of justice and understanding." As night settled over the neighborhood, Henry sat in his darkened living room, Maria's picture catching the last light. "Well, honey," he whispered, "I think we're finally building something here, something that might last." Sarah touched his shoulder gently. "Danny and I should head home. Will you be okay?" Henry smiled, genuine warmth reaching his eyes. "More than okay. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm where I need to be." Through his windows, he could see porch lights coming on up and down the street, not in fear now, but in welcome. The neighborhood was changing, healing, growing, into something stronger than before. His security cameras showed empty streets, peaceful and quiet. No more gangs, no more hatred, no more fear. Just the possibility of something better taking root in the soil of understanding. Tomorrow would bring more work, more healing, more rebuilding. But tonight, Henry Thompson sat in his wheelchair, content in the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victories come not from destroying what's wrong, but from building what's right. Outside, crickets chirped in the darkness, and a cool breeze carried the promise of change. Henry closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the past lifting from his shoulders. The war was truly over now, not just the fighting, but the hatred that had fueled it. Let them build, he thought. Let them learn that strength comes in many forms, that courage wears many faces, and that the strongest communities are built not on fear and division, but on understanding and redemption. The future would bring what it would bring, but for now, Henry Thompson had found his peace, not in the silence of surrender, but in the symphony of reconstruction.